Welcome to the Fearless Church podcast. Do you feel understood by your spouse? A study from the Gottman Institute was able to predict with over 90% accuracy whether a couple would still be married in 5 years simply by observing how they talk to each other. Communication is key to the health and vitality of any relationship, but this is especially true in our marriages. Unfortunately, many of us have multiple negative communication patterns that prevent our spouse from understanding what we're trying to communicate. We need to learn and ultimately eliminate those patterns from our life. This week, Pastor Chris and his wife Kristell will share how they are learning to overcome these patterns in their own marriage as they help others be understood, known, and loved by their spouse.
Well, this morning we're continuing our message series, Don't Give Up. And I'm honored and privileged to have a partner in sharing with this message. And this is my partner in crime for now over 22 years, my lovely bride, Kristell. And if you would, join me. Let's give her a round of applause. Welcome her. So I decided, okay, I'm going to plan a romantic rendezvous, right? We're going to get away for the weekend. It's going to be great. So I talked to my friend Jason. He said, you know where you need to go? I said, where? And he said, go to Hot Springs, Arkansas. And I was like, Hot Springs, Arkansas? He said, yeah, Hot Springs, Arkansas. And he said, and while you're there, go to one of those authentic bathhouses. I'm like, what is this? And he said, well, there's mineral water that is underneath. It forms the hot springs, and it's very therapeutic. Some people believe that it even has healing powers or whatever, and people just go there. It's like this wonderful spa experience. He said, but the important thing to remember is when you go to that thing, make sure it's a private bathhouse experience because they do have public ones, and there's a bunch of people around. It's a little awkward. He said, my wife and I did it. It was very romantic. In my mind, I'm picturing the Cialis commercial with two bathtubs and holding hands and that kind of thing. I'm like, all right, this sounds good. So I booked the thing. We show up for our private, authentic bathhouse experience, sitting in the lobby, and the guy says, Mr. Williams, will you come with me? So I stand up. I'm like, okay, this is weird. They're kind of separated. So I walk away. And as I'm walking and following him, a lady comes out and says, Mrs. Williams, will you come with me? And so she takes Kristell over to a different area into an elevator. She walks into the elevator.
And it takes me to a completely different floor. And it takes me to the second floor, and the, doors open up, and I realize I'm in a ladies' locker room area. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that's what they're doing. They're kind of preparing us. I go to the ladies' locker room, he goes to the men's locker room, and we'll eventually come back together for our private bathhouse experience. Okay, this is okay, it's gonna go okay. And she takes me to this little cubby area, and she takes me to my locker, and she says, Mrs. Williams, this is where you're gonna undress. I'll be right back with your cover. And I thought, okay, this is okay. So I start taking off my earrings, and I start to undress, and all of a sudden, she pulls back the shower curtain.
And I'm standing there completely naked. And I'm like, all right, this is happening right now. And if you're following the story, I'm not in the same part of the building as Kristell, okay? Instead, there is a male standing in front of me with a big bed sheet, and he's like, sir, please step forward. And I thought, well, this is it. This is where I lose my job. Career's over. It's done. So in great faith, I go ahead and just obey the guy who has clothes on. And I step forward, and he starts to wrap me with this bed sheet.
And she wraps me tightly like this bed sheet burrito thing. And I'm wrapped up so tightly, I can't move my arms. And she goes, come follow me. And I'm so tightly wound that I'm like, okay. So I start scuttling, kind of trying to follow after her. And I'm thinking, okay, this is where I meet my husband. This is where we have this relaxing, private bathhouse experience, right? And she opens up these double doors, and I walk in, and I'm in this large room with all these other ladies and these row of bathtubs, and I'm thinking, well, this isn't right. And so she takes me to this bathtub, she starts drawing the water, and she goes, okay. She unwraps me and says, get in the tub. And I'm like, oh.
So I'm sitting there in this bathtub with a room full of other naked dudes in bathtubs thinking, this is not the Cialis commercial. Something's gone drastically wrong. But when life gives you lemons, right? The guy says to me, hey, would you like some soap? And I'm like, I'm already all in on this thing. Sure. He grabs a towel, gets some soap, starts soaping and sudsing up. He reaches down to the water, and he grabs my
leg. And she starts soaping up my leg. And I'm thinking, I don't know what's happening here. I'm paralyzed in fear. This is what trauma is, right? I'm in trauma mode. And I'm thinking, what have I done that I have found myself, a grown woman, in a bathtub, in a bathhouse in Hot Springs, Arkansas, being bathed by another grown woman?
And we're paying for this. So quickly, as fast as I could, I get out of the bathhouse experience, find myself in the lobby with the other guys who have been violated as I was, and we're sitting quietly. Nobody's making eye contact. Nobody's saying a word. The elevator doors open up. Kristell steps out, and she says,
I walk over to him, I can't even make eye contact, and I say, not a word, not a word. And in the corner of my eye, I see the glowing red glow of the exit sign, and I start making a beeline to the exit sign because I can't get out of there fast enough. I walk out of the building, I go over to the corner of the road, and in true Chris Williams fashion, he leans over to me and he says, well, was it good for you? And I was like, hey! Oh my goodness, what was that? What was that? I feel so dirty, I feel like I need to take a shower.
It said private bathhouse experience. What I learned from that romantic weekend, it got better, don't worry, was the word private. It's really important what that communicates. And as you already know this, communication is so important in our lives, but especially in our marriages. So whether we're dealing with conflict, in-laws, finances, sex, whatever it may be, it ultimately comes down to this one word, the word communication. There's a group called the Gottman Institute, and they study relational dynamics, and they have been able to predict with over 90% accuracy whether a couple will still be married in 5 years from today based only on watching how they talk to each other. How we communicate as husbands and wives is extremely important. Not just how we communicate, but even one layer down, why we communicate. In fact, what is the goal of communication? And you think about, okay, when I'm in a conversation with my wife, maybe my goal is to be right. I want to make sure, and if you know you're married to that type of person, you're like, oh yeah, that's him, that's her, always making sure they're right. Or maybe it's to get my point across. You say, well, if we're talking, if we're discussing, especially if we're disagreeing, it's to get my point across. Or these last two are me. My goal is to win the argument. If there's conflict and Kristell is wrong, I need to tell her why she's wrong. I'm in it to win it. Ultimately, so I can get my own way. Now, these are not the proper reasons for communication. In fact, I want you to write this down or remember it, whatever it may be. The goal of communication is understanding. The goal of communication is understanding. Do I understand what she's thinking, what she's feeling, maybe even why she's thinking that, why she's feeling that way? And understanding is so important because understanding leads to knowing, and knowing leads to loving. And Jesus told us the most important thing in this world, if you were to sum up all that he taught, in fact, all the law, all the prophets, Jesus would say it's summed up in this way: love. That we would love God and that we would love one another. But here's the reality, and think about this for a moment. It's really hard to love who you don't know. In fact, that's kind of the deal with God in some of us, right? It's hard to know, we love God who we don't know. So we come to church to get to know him better. And we want to know him better by understanding him better. There's things about God that you've read in the Bible and you're like, well, why did he say this or do this and not say that or do that? Or why did God allow this to happen in my life or that to happen in my life? And you're seeking to understand God so that you can know the one true God. Because you know if you can truly know him, you're going to respond by loving him. The same is true with our spouses. Your spouse, your husband, your wife, they want to be loved by you. And they want you to truly love the real them. Not the person that they can project at work or at school or on the sports field. They want you to know them and love the true person that they are. And more than that, they want you to understand them. To understand them. And so Kristell and I, about 10 years ago, we were part of this marriage ministry called Re-Engage. And some of you have been a part of it, or maybe you're a part of it right now. We have it here at Fearless Church, and it's basically a ministry where you get put in a small group, and the goal is to just learn how to do marriage God's way, right? And some people in the group are followers of Jesus, and some people aren't, but everybody kind of agrees, all right, we're going to see what the Bible says to have to do with marriage. And during that class, and we've taken it 5 times, okay? We're not experts yet, but we keep returning back. We've learned that there's oftentimes some negative things that we do that actually prevents us from understanding one another. They call them negative communication patterns. And this morning, what we want to do for just a couple of minutes is we want to share with you those 4 negative communication patterns and how they played themselves out in our marriage, and hopefully help you think about how it plays out in your marriage, or if you're not married, even in other relationships. So here, we want to make it really easy to remember. And that is, when it comes to understanding, don't be a weenie. Oh, I skipped that slide completely. That's good to know. All right. Let me go back to something real quick on this slide. Here's something important to remember. When it comes to understanding, this is not just your wife's goal for you husbands or your vice versa. This is God's goal for you as a couple. In fact, husbands, we are commanded that we have to live with our wives in an understanding way. We are commanded to understand them, to be a student of them, to understand how they think, how they feel, why they think, why they feel certain ways. And so we've got to remove any and every obstacle to understanding, and we ourselves got to remember to not be a weenie, okay? So I want you to remember that, and each one of the letters in this acronym stand for one of the negative communication patterns. So the first one is W. So Kristell, what does W stand for?
So W in the W.E.N.I acronym stands for withdraw, or another way to say it is avoidance. So what does withdrawal look like? It could be, or it is an unwillingness to stay in or get in important discussions. It could be as direct as leaving the conversation when things get heated, or it could be subtle, like shutting down emotionally and giving that blank stare. It could be saying anything to avoid the topic, like, okay, I'm sorry, just drop it. I am a withdrawer, so I'm just confessing that to you guys. Growing up, I always saw conflict as a bad thing, and you do whatever you can to avoid it. And in marriage, when we're in conflict, I get emotional, and I don't like to get emotional, so I just completely shut down, or I'll leave, and I'll go for a walk. And this isn't healthy in any relationship, but especially in marriage, because you can't progress if you just continually avoid and withdraw, because you're essentially putting a roadblock between you and your spouse. Okay, we're not going here, we're not going to talk about this, we're not going to talk about this, we're not going to talk about that. And the longer you do this, well, the more roadblocks you put in place. And the more roadblocks you put in place, the more distance you put between you and your spouse, physically, emotionally, relationally, and even spiritually. But I want to encourage you that if you are a withdrawer, there is a better way for you to understand yourself and understand the person that you're in conflict, your spouse. First and foremost, you got to see conflict as an opportunity. It's not a bad word. It can be an opportunity for you to glorify God. It can be an opportunity for you to grow yourself, and it can be an opportunity for you to grow in your relationship with others if you'll press in. So how do you do that? Well, you got to stay in the conversation. That's important. Even though it's awkward, even though it can be hard, even though you're not comfortable with it, stay in the conversation. Or if you can't at that very particular time, explain why you can't do that right now. That may involve taking a time out. But if you do that, agree to set a time in. One of the things that we've learned is that, like I said, I'm a withdrawer, but I need to be able to set a time in for Chris to say, okay, we're not going to just avoid this. We're not going to just throw this under the rug. Okay, within 24 hours, we're going to come back to this. And what that does is that's not, okay, I'm just going to leave you hanging to just think the worst or whatever. We're coming back to this. In Proverbs 15:23, it says this: a person takes joy in giving an answer and a timely word, how good that is. Now, what that means is, okay, we're going to take a time out. We're going to kind of withdraw for just a season, a little spick of time. But what we're going to do is we're going to think about, okay, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? In order to bring resolution. Because we're coming back to this. Our goal is to understand one another and to bring reconciliation and resolution to our relationship. Now, what do you do if you're married to a withdrawer? There is a better way for you to understand yourself and to understand your spouse. One way is to ask, hey, what is it that I could do, or what is it that I do that makes it difficult for you to stay in the conversation? Another question is, what could I do that would make you feel safe to stay and to press into this? And last, listen with genuine concern and a humble heart. This will actually help tear down those roadblocks and repave a way and a road for you to have healing, reconciliation, and strength in your communication as a spouse. So that's withdrawal. What's the next one?
So the next one in the W.E.N.I acronym is E, escalation. And Reengage defines escalation this way. Escalation occurs when you respond negatively towards your spouse and the conversation continues to get more and more hostile. And this can be the yelling and screaming like you're imagining, right? But it can also be the subtle, the little sarcastic remarks, the jokes, the name calling, the threats. And if you want to destroy your marriage in a really fast way, then continue to escalate. And the reason I know that is because this is me. This is my biggest roadblock in negative communication, is I yell. I come from a family of origin. When we had disagreements, we talked louder, we talked faster. And my goal in yelling is try to control the conversation and ultimately, honestly, control the outcome of whatever ends up happening. And I'm passionate about my point of view. Like, it's my preference, it's my opinion, it's my idea, so I'm going to argue that. And when we first got married, Kristell used to say, hey, if your point's so good, you don't need to yell it, which made me twitch. And I thought, she clearly doesn't understand, so I need to talk louder and faster, right? And here's what we've learned. And this is without fail. I can't even think of an exception to this. Every time I escalate, guess what she does? She withdraws. Yeah, you guessed it. So we have this cycle. We have conflict. We have disagreement. I escalate. I start yelling. She withdraws. I escalate by following around the house, making sure she understands my point. She starts to cry. I get mad at myself because I've made my wife cry. I escalate, and I start thinking there's got to be a better way. And I'm learning. I'm not going to say that I learned completely. It's still a process, right? I'm learning there is a better way. In fact, we just addressed this. If you are someone that struggles with escalation, you got to be humble. You got to be honest about this. You need to call the timeout. Don't make the other person call the timeout. You start to recognize, whoa. I'm starting to get more emotional than rational. I need 10 minutes. I need an hour. And this is hard. You've got to do it from a heart of humility because you're relinquishing what you think is your method of controlling the conversation. So you're taking the time out, and this is so important. You've got to set that time and appointment. I know a lot of couples, and I've watched a lot of damage happen because they're really good at number one. And it's something like this. I'm done with this conversation. And then what they do is whatever issue it is, whatever disagreement, whatever conflict is swept underneath the rug. And 1 week turns into a couple months, turns into a few years of not addressing this repeated cycle that keeps coming up because they don't prioritize, and maybe you're in this category, resolving that conflict. Because many of you believe conflict is a bad word. And yes, conflict can be very damaging. Conflict can hurt you and others. But conflict can also be, as Kristell just said, a great opportunity to grow in your depth and intimacy with your spouse. Conflict is not something to be feared. It's something to be navigated with great wisdom and with a heart towards reconciliation, restoration, and building up strength in your marriage. So don't be scared of conflict. You set the time and you say, you know what? Right now, emotions are too high. We're going to come back and talk about this later. And then also, finally, if you're an escalator, ask yourself this question, maybe at the next time at the end of your conflict, is do I listen more than I talk? Again, for those fellow escalators in the room, right? What do? We use our words to control it, to control the conversation, possibly control the outcome. So we're talking a lot more than we're listening. And I would challenge you in humility and in faith to say, you know what? I'm going to listen. The half-brother of Jesus, he said a verse that I've had to memorize. He said this, he said, let every person be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Or let's just put it this way, slow to escalate. Now, as you read that verse on that screen, think about it. If you're a fellow escalator, think about how many times you've disobeyed the scripture. And there's a lot of regret, honestly, in my own heart, because I think many times I've hurt others, including my wife, because I wasn't quick to listen. I wasn't slow to speak. Instead, I wanted to control the conversation, so I escalated, and I caused much hurt and pain. But when you're quick to listen and you're slow to speak, what's your number one goal in communication? It's not to get your point across. It's not to win the argument. It's to understand the other person. And if I don't remember correctly, at the very beginning, we talked about this. The goal of communication is understanding. So what do you do if you're married to an escalator? You're married to the person and you're like, man, this person, and it's not always the guys, it's ladies too. Like they escalate, they blow things up. Maybe they're not yelling, but the way that they're hostile in the conversation, what do? Well, the number one thing we would recommend is you need to create rules of engagement. So whenever we're doing premarital counseling, Kristell and I talk with the couple and we said, you need to establish rules of engagement before you get married. How are you going to argue? How are you going to address conflict and disagreements in your marriages? And all starry-eyed, a lot of them say, well, we already came up with that. We're not going to argue. So I'm like, then you're not getting married. Like you're not ready. Because it's okay to disagree. It's okay. You're going to have conflict. That's a natural thing. Prepare for it. So we have rules of engagement like the 24-hour rule. Another one that Kristell made up in the beginning. I hated it, but I'll tell you what it is. It's loud is not allowed. I don't like it because it rhymes and memorable. I'm like, no! Loud is allowed, but loud is not allowed. And what she's saying to me is, Chris, I will talk to you about anything for as long as you want to. But when you begin to raise your voice, it brings about fear in my own heart. Fear from my past, from things that were said and done. And like, I don't respond. I'm going to withdraw every time. And if you're married to an escalator, and I want to compliment you, you do this really good, is be calm. You're de-escalating the situation, so don't match them. Like they're yelling, and you're like, oh yeah, watch this. I'll get a megaphone. Like you're not going to go back and forth, right? And you end up on the TV show Cops that way. Don't do that, right? But you're going to be calm, you're going to be clear, and you're going to be consistent. And again, Kristell's done this. She said, it's that warning. She knows I'm getting emotional, and she's like, look, If you keep raising your voice like that, like we're going to have to take a timeout. Nothing wrong with the timeout, but I'm going to disengage from the conversation. And all glory to God, I can honestly sit in front of all of you today, and Kristell can vouch for this. It's been 2 years, a little over 2 years, since the last time I escalated. I'm not saying I'm completely healed from it and don't still make the mistake, but there's been progress made. The final thing, and this is really important, sometimes you need to seek outside support. Outside support, I'm talking about professional counseling. Throughout our marriage, Kristell and I have taken times where we've gone to counselors. Sometimes in crisis, other times we go when we're really healthy. Like right now, we go for regular checkups, and we just sit in front of the counselor because we do not want a marriage that survives. We want a marriage that thrives. We're going to do whatever it takes to make our marriage strong. Nobody else is worried about our marriage, but we're going to fight for our marriage. Same with you. So sometimes you need those professional counselors to help you walk through these escalation things because you're not making progress. You also need biblical community. This is why we push community groups so much around here. You need other people in your life that know you, the real you, the you that is actually an escalator. They need to know that to speak into your marriage. And finally, and this may sound extreme, but escalation can often move to abuse. Physical, sexual, emotional, verbal abuse is never okay. It's sin against God. It's sin against people. It is destructive and it is dangerous. And there are times, yes, the escalation has turned to abuse and you need professional counselors. You need somebody to step in. Sometimes you need to pick up the phone and call the police. Until you feel safe, you as a couple will never make progress. It may sound extreme, but sometimes when you're dealing with an escalator, you need to seek outside support. Don't be a weenie. Don't withdraw. Don't escalate. And Kristell, what's the next one?
That's good stuff. All right, N. N stands for negative interpretation. So what is negative interpretation? Negative interpretation is assigning a motive to another person that is more negative than is really the case. Negative interpretation can be an indicator that there is some kind of underlying insecurity in that particular area. You know you negatively interpret when a simple question like, do we have any bread, turns into this internal dialogue in your brain about how really no one loves you or appreciates the sacrifices that you make as a spouse or a parent when really someone just had trouble finding bread in the pantry. It's kind of a benign thing. So I am a negative interpreter, and I already shared with you that I am a withdrawer. So those two sometimes go hand in hand. And I avoid sometimes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I've left the conflict. That means that I'm mulling it over in my brain, and what happens then is the enemy starts having a field day, and then there's this war that goes on in my thoughts. Thoughts like, well, see, he's never going to change, or see, he's just like so-and-so. And I have this replay in my brain, and I start to dwell on times of conflict that we've had in the past, not on times of growth, not on times of progress, not on times where we've had victory, myself or him, but on those times of conflict. And I start to assign intent where things have gone awry. But I want to encourage you, if you are a negative interpreter, there is a better way for you to understand yourself and understand your spouse. First, and this is important, recognize your tendency and your pattern of thinking to negatively interpret and think the worst in any situation. And second, this is hard, choose to believe the best. This is not in your natural tendency, but it's a muscle that you have to stretch. If you're not in a good place to start with, this is really something you're going to have to work hard at. So choosing to believe the best involves two things. One, choose to believe the best about God. Choose to believe that He is for you and for your marriage, because He is. And second, choose to believe the best about your spouse. Choose to believe that your spouse is for you and is for your marriage. This may even involve you saying these things out loud. I know my spouse is not my enemy. I know my spouse is for me, and I am for my spouse. We have an enemy. He or she is not it. And memorize scriptures. This is one of the things that I've done that has been very helpful for me. As I have shared with you, I'm a negative interpreter. And Philippians 4:8 has been something that's very helpful to me. So if you're a negative interpreter, you might want to write that reference down. Philippians 4:8 says this, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about, another translation says this, dwell upon these things. So in those moments when you're struggling internally to think about the worst in your spouse or the worst of your marriage, choose to think about whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable. Have the scripture replaying in your mind, and then find those examples of what's going on in your relationship. Find those good things to dwell on. And last but not least, When in doubt, ask for clarification. There are times when things are said or done and you're not really sure about the intent, and instead of filling in the blanks with your spouse, ask them, hey babe, when you said this or when you did this, what did you mean by that? And let them fill in the blanks for themselves. Let them speak for themselves rather than you filling in the blank for them. Now, if you're married to a negative interpreter, there's a better way for you to understand yourself and your spouse as well. One, realize it's not always about you. Like I said before, negative interpretation usually comes from a place of insecurity, and that place of insecurity usually starts with a place of woundedness. And that wound may have been there long before you ever showed up on the scene. It may have been there in their family of origin. It may have been some other past relationship. Now, this doesn't give your spouse an excuse to always negatively interpret everything you do. Everyone is responsible for their own healing. But this may be a place where you give your spouse some grace and understand they're on a journey of healing just like you are. So understand that this may not be something that's necessarily about you. Secondly, pray for your spouse. Negative interpretation is a war that happens internally, and Satan has a field day with our thoughts. And so Philippians 4:8 may be a good place to start as far as praying over your spouse. Be an advocate for the war that is happening internally with them. And lastly, ask for forgiveness. When we're in the heat of the moment, when we're in conflict with one another, sometimes we do say things that are ugly. Sometimes we say those passive-aggressive things that we know are going to just be that little jab here and there. If you said or did something to hurt your spouse, own up to it and ask for forgiveness. This is important because the next time you're in conflict and they have that internal dialogue like, man, I don't really know if my spouse is for us, is really for our marriage, they're going to remember when you came back and owned up and asked for forgiveness, and they're going to be able to say, nope, I know that my spouse is for me. I know that my spouse is for our marriage because last time they came back and they owned up to it and they asked for forgiveness, and so they're working at this just as hard as I am. And so those are the ways to better understand yourself and your spouse. That's negative interpretation. So W is for withdrawal, E is for escalation, N is for negative interpretation, and what's I?
I is for invalidation. Now, re-engage describes invalidation as this. It occurs when you directly or indirectly dismiss, minimize, or put down the thoughts, feelings, or character of your spouse. You can think about that directly and you think, man, I don't know if I do that, but it's the subtle things too. It's these cross-examination or attack mode. It's when you're picking apart your spouse's opinions or ideas or thoughts or feelings. And you use language like, well, you shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't think that way. Or why do you see it that way? And I noticed for me, and this has been really recent, the last 3 years or so, I've realized that our entire marriage, that I invalidate Kristell anytime she expresses a negative thought or a feeling to me. So she might say to me, Chris, today I feel really sad because I miss Christian. And I tell her, you shouldn't feel sad. He's away at college. He's spreading his wings. He's growing up. It's great. That's not a good way to feel. Don't be sad. Because I'm worried that if she gets sad, she's going to stay sad. And I'm always optimistic and trying to turn things to the positive. Or even more importantly, there's times that she has said to me multiple times, man, what they said, what they did, it really hurt me. And of course, you know what I do? I defend the other person. I say, they didn't mean that. You shouldn't feel that way. I'm always trying to turn it around so she'll see the positive perspective, not a negative perspective. And Kristell has told me, like, Chris, every time you do that, it shuts me down. Like, can you just let me say today sucks? And I'm like, I don't know. When I was growing up, suck's a bad word, girl. Like, come on. So today's thing, no. Like, it's sometimes you just got to validate. And then those of us that you're like me and you're optimistic and encouraging, like, use that gift that God's given you to help give another perspective, but validate and encourage. And by me invalidating all these feelings that she's had, what I've shown her is that I'm never going to protect her. She feels unsafe and alone. And I have to say, no, I can't do it. In fact, the Apostle Paul advised, we need to consider the other person. Listen to what he says in Philippians 2. He says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourself. In other words, I've got to look at Kristell's perspective. She's going to have fears that I don't have. She's going to have frustrations that I don't have. And I've got to consider those things. And Paul continues on in this next verse, and he says, let each of you look not only to your own interests, but the interests of others. You know what your perspective is. That doesn't frustrate me. It shouldn't frustrate you. That doesn't scare me. It shouldn't scare you. That didn't hurt me. It shouldn't hurt. Instead of me being wrapped up in my own perspective, my own view, instead taking that next step and saying, now, wait a second. Why? Why did what they say hurt you? And I'm learning there is a better way, and I would encourage you, if you're a person that invalidates, and you honestly may not know if you're that type of person, so go ahead and ask your spouse, not right now, but sometime today. If you're that person, I want to encourage you, what I'm learning is that, remember, the goal of communication is what? It's understanding, not agreement. Our entire marriage, I thought, man, I've got to get her to agree. I disagree with her. Let me convince her why her thought, her emotion is not valid. I got to get her to agree with me. And now I'm realizing, over 20 years of marriage, it took me a long time, but it's okay if we disagree. I don't need to agree. I just need to understand. So this last year, I started asking her this question too. Do you feel valued and understood? Regularly, this is something I'm asking her. And when she says no, I say, well, then why not? Or when she says yes, I'm saying, okay, why? What did I do? What did I say that made you feel valued and made you feel understood? I don't want to invalidate my wife. You don't want to invalidate your spouse. So what if you're married to someone who invalidates? I want to encourage you to not withdraw and maybe not negatively interpret, but instead speak up, advocate for yourself, and say things like this. You know what? When you say or do this, I feel this. Again, this is not accusation. Accusation is something like, you made me mad. You hurt me. That's accusation. Instead, own your own response and say carefully, like, when you didn't show up to dinner tonight, I felt like what I did to prepare this meal and get ready, that you didn't value that at all. When you keep interrupting me when I'm trying to express my thought, I keep thinking you don't value my opinion or my perspective on this issue. And flip it to the positive way, even coaching, and Kristell's done this well, like I feel valued and I feel understood when you do this. One of the things Kristell shared with me, like when you don't interrupt, using that example, and listen to my whole thought process, it makes me feel understood. And this week I finally actually did it right for once, right? We were talking about this certain issue, and she said, when it comes to this particular topic, like I'm just done. I'm done. And so instead of describing to her why she shouldn't be done, and persistence is highly valued in the Bible, you got to keep going, right? Instead, I say to her, what does done mean? And guess what I did? I shut my mouth and listened. And I realized what she meant by done was totally different than what I thought she meant. I was like, okay, that makes sense. I can help in that situation. It's listening, it's learning, it's understanding. It's understanding because remember, the Apostle Peter said, look, we've got to treat our spouses, husbands to the wives and even wives to the husband, with understanding. As you live, as you navigate life together, when it comes to understanding, don't be a weenie.
So how do we avoid being a weenie? First and foremost, we have to identify our own patterns. And don't sit here and think, well, I don't have any negative communication patterns, because we all have them. We all have one, possibly two. So ask yourself, hey, what are my top two negative communication patterns? And don't stop there. Identify your spouse's top two negative communication patterns. And like us, they're typically going to be opposite each other. And then ask, hey, what are the causes? Identify the cause of you and your spouse's negative communication patterns. Ask your spouse, hey, what is it that I say or do that causes you to withdraw? Or even ask, like, well, I don't even know why I withdraw. Maybe, it could have come from my family of origin. Never even really thought about that. Or maybe I withdraw because this happened when I was younger. Whatever. Identify the causes of your top two negative communication patterns and discuss that between each other. And last but not least, use the words. These are very helpful words in this vocabulary if you will use them in your everyday communication with one another. When you say or do that, I feel invalidated, and here's why. For example, we actually, thank you, Jesus, had an opportunity to use these as an example this week, because Jesus is funny that way, and he's like, here's an example. And so we had a disagreement this week, and it was really good because as we were discussing, I sat at the kitchen table and I said, okay, I just want you to know I'm trying really hard not to negatively interpret right now, but I'm going to share with you the thoughts that are going on in my brain right now. And I did, and I shared with him what was going on. And it was a very vulnerable moment for me, but it was helpful in that he started to understand, oh, okay, there's this internal dialogue that's happening as we're having this external communication, and I'm beginning to understand why you're starting to see these things this way rather than what I'm trying to communicate. And so it was helpful for us to include that into our communication and brought about resolution, and it was really healthy. And so I just want to encourage you and want you to remember, as you communicate with your spouse, don't be a weenie. Don't withdraw, don't escalate, don't negatively interpret, or invalidate one another, but seek to understand. That's the goal of communication. Seek to understand your spouse.
So what would it be like in your marriage if you felt understood, known, and loved by your spouse? I mean, imagine if your husband, if your wife said, look, when it comes to us communicating, whether it's the simple things of a day or the lighthearted, fun conversations, or whether it's the really deep and sometimes difficult issues we have to discuss in our marriage, my goal is to understand you so that I can know you and love you. And what if you and I didn't wait for our spouse? What if we said, you know what? I'm going to draw the circle around myself and I'm going to work on everybody inside the circle. The reality is you can't control what your spouse does. You may be sitting beside them today and you're thinking, man, I really hope she's listening. She may not be, but you can control what you do. What if your spouse, over the rest of this month, over the rest of this year, if they could say, you know what? He or she makes me feel understood, known, and loved. And what if the next time that there is a disagreement and there is a conflict in your marriage, you don't give up and you don't be a weenie and you seek to understand? Because when you understand and when you're understood, you will be known and loved like never before. Don't be a weenie. Seek to understand.
Thank you so much for tuning in with us today. One of our goals at Fearless is take new ground. We want to always be looking for ways that God wants to work in and through us as we grow closer to Him. And talking with other followers of Jesus to sharpen our faith and have accountability is one way to do that. So keep listening as a special guest joins us for a conversation going through our discussion questions. Also, if you're married, we believe in coming alongside you in your marriage and giving you practical ways to work on your relationship with your spouse. So, for the month of February, every Monday through Friday, once a day, we will be sending out a marriage challenge for you to do for and with your spouse. Pull out your phone and text PRO TIPS, that's PROTIPS, no caps, no spaces, to 97,000. Do it. Take the challenge. Make the investment. See what God can do in just 1 month. Hi everyone, welcome to our Take New Ground segment. I'm Grace Volts, and today I have my hubby, Chris Volts.
That's me.
To do the discussion questions with me. So, you want to tell me the first one?
Sure. This will be great. This will be a practice of communication. How well we do. So, number one is share a funny or embarrassing story that occurred while you were on a date with your spouse.
Okay, we thought about these beforehand, and the only one that we could think of was the story of our first kiss.
It's not embarrassing for me.
It's not embarrassing for Chris. It's embarrassing for me. I had never kissed anybody before I started dating Chris. So he's like my first boyfriend, first kiss. And I told him, I said, you need to surprise me because I'm nervous. I don't know what to do if somebody kisses me / if I kiss them. I've never done it before. But Chris did not surprise me. He basically, in this like cute way, long story short, he told me that I had to kiss him and I didn't know what to do. So I just sort of sat there, and when he kissed me, I didn't move my lips. I just sat
felt like
there.
Kissing a dead fish.
I sat there with my lips pursed together like an old school marm, and it was just the most embarrassing. I mean, it's really, really bad. So for anyone out there, if you have a really bad first kiss with someone, there's still a high chance that you could have a good marriage.
Yeah. God's grace restores all things.
Okay. Let's look at number 2. Why do you think understanding is so important in marriage?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Chris and Kristell obviously said today in their sermon, the goal of communication is understanding, not necessarily to be right, not necessarily to win the argument or anything like that. It's to understand. And so as I was thinking about this and reflecting on it, I think understanding is so important. Like mutual understanding of one another is important because of our need for like empathy. Like if you've ever had relationships in your life where people can't ever put themselves in your shoes or like see from your perspective, it's hard to continue that relationship. That relationship will suffer drastically if you can't really like empathize with them or think in the ways that they are thinking. And so especially in a marriage when there's so much mutual dependence on one another, and like going through highs and lows in life and all this kind of stuff, you really want someone who can understand you, who can empathize with you.
Yeah.
And when you're having a terrible day, like not just sort of be unable to, I don't know, come alongside you and see from your shoes, but just sort of like be like, oh man, that sounds hard. Like you want someone who really understands where you're coming from.
I would even take it a step further. Like, I feel like if I'm understood, then that means I'm known. And so if I feel known by my spouse and I feel like I know my spouse, I don't know. I think that in our marriage, at least, it's allowed me to understand the love of Jesus a little bit more too, because if I feel understood, then I feel known. And if you love me, then I feel like I know Jesus better. So I feel like that's important in a marriage. Like you can't even, if you don't understand each other, then you can't really demonstrate Christ's love for us if you're not understood, because he understands us.
Yeah. I think
maybe that's too
he
deep,
is. I mean,
that's what I'm thinking.
That's in Hebrews.
Yeah.
Like it talks about how he's not someone who can't sympathize with our weaknesses or can't understand our sin. Jesus, when he was here, he was tempted in every way that we were, and he went through it. And it's like, no, you have a way to understand.
Yeah.
Or he's given us a way to understand one another. Like he came and he understood us, and like he desires that we have people in our lives that understand one another and show his love to one another.
Yeah. So here's number 3. When do you feel understood by me, babe?
I don't have a good answer for this one. I was trying to think through what, like, if there's specific things you do or specific things you say. It seemed like Chris and Kristell had all these, like, oh, we have these statements that are well crafted and all that.
Oh,
Probably
yeah.
because they prepared the sermon,
Sure.
obviously. But I don't know that we have some magic formula of when you do this, I feel so understood by you. I do feel understood by you when you will talk things out loud with me. So I'm a verbal processor. I will just start a sentence and not really know where it's going to end.
Yeah.
As I'm thinking out loud. And you are not that way. Very, very much think way before you speak.
Yeah.
Think before you speak.
This is
which
true.
is fine. But when you're willing to just sort of go along with me in whatever arena, whether it's not necessarily always in a fight or a discussion or argument or whatever, even just in conversation normally, I feel understood when we just sit and just talk together.
Yeah.
About anything and process with me. And not coming at it from I have already formed my conclusion about this topic or this idea, but I feel understood when it's like, oh, cool, we're dialoguing about this and you're talking it out with me.
Yeah, you put a lot of stock in whether or not someone can dream with you. And so I feel like when I'm able to dream with you or brainstorm things and not have to think through them and figure out if they'll work out perfectly before I give my yes or my no, I feel like that does make you feel understood. I would say, honestly, I feel understood by you when... Well, a lot of times, but with one in particular, this is the first thing I thought of, is when we're having a disagreement. I think because I need to think before I say something out loud. We've had some super long conversations where it's just like, no, I need to keep talking about this because I don't really feel like you understand where I'm coming from yet. And I mean, I remember we've stayed up for like hours before because I'm like, no, you don't understand why I'm mad. And you'll be like, okay, what am I missing? But for you to be willing to continue on in that conversation instead of getting frustrated, I think always makes me feel understood, or at least it makes me feel like you think that understanding me is important enough to put your preferences about how a conversation goes to the side.
Yeah, I think that is definitely true. It is a conscious choice to
Yes.
sit in those moments, because I don't process things to that depth or to that length. It's like, it's normal for you to have thought through a situation or an idea or a concept for hours. And so to enter into a conversation
You're
like
not
that,
hyperbolizing.
like, I'm just like, I don't even know.
Yeah.
Like, how can you still be talking about, this decision? There's not that much of this decision. Just either go for it or don't go for it. It's like, that's the way that I would think. So it is a conscious choice to make sure that I'm sitting in that process with you. Because you are valuable to me, and processing with you, I know, makes you feel loved.
Yes.
And it stretches me as well.
Yeah. And just, I think that I'm my biggest critic. So when I'm able to actually say whatever I want to say and still feel safe enough to say it, like, oh, I don't feel any judgment from Chris. He knows that I'm probably already judging myself. So it's just, I do feel very understood when you listen and don't make me feel like a horrible person for the things that I think that are horrible. So, okay, last one. What are your top 2 negative communication patterns from the W.E.N.I acronym? So if you don't remember exactly W.E.N.I, those are 4 different letters that give us 4 negative communication patterns that people trend towards. So there's W, which is withdraw, E, escalate,
N, negatively interpret, or I, invalidate.
Got it.
Did you have me read those because you know that my top one is I? Or
No, I just couldn't remember them, honestly.
Sure.
I couldn't remember them.
No,
I'm
that's
like,
fine.
well, let Chris finish.
Yep. I mean, one of mine is definitely invalidate. Like, I'll probably verbally process and figure out what my other one is, but for sure, my first one is I. And I think it's something that I've had to work really hard on, because I don't even realize that I'm doing it. You're just, it is a little bit of what Chris said today, where he does that with Kristell by just he's an optimistic person. So if someone's negative, it's like, oh, well, no, be positive. And you're sort of invalidating that opinion of the person, and literally doing the exact opposite of understanding them or empathizing with them. You're just saying, nope, you feel a certain way, you shouldn't. Not cool. Like,
Or it's not that bad. It's okay. It's going to be fine.
Yeah. And so I think, I don't know that I think I've gotten a lot better at not saying things that are invalidating, but it is always my first thought. Like, my first thoughts are always that way. And you can't, especially in a marriage, like, what I'm thinking.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Even if I can hide it, and maybe not say it overtly, it will always come out. Like, my tone or something in there, you'll realize, like, oh,
yeah. I mean,
he doesn't
if I'm
actually think that I'm.
Yeah, if something's bothering me, or if I'm stewing about something that happened earlier that day, or if something has made me angry, and I'll vent to Chris about it, and in his silence, I know he disagrees. Like, so what? Do you not think I'm right? Do you not? So it's definitely.
Yeah, it is. It's just it is something that I don't want to do, but I do think it comes from just, I don't know, years worth of life living with. I'm the youngest of 3 brothers. And so it's just like, man, constant invalidation, sarcastic remarks, making fun of everything that everyone says. And it's like picking apart, like, I think that was what they said, the re-engage definition involved, literally like picking apart someone else's thoughts and arguments and thought process. And it is like, it's sort of what I do.
Yes, it is.
So let's get to you. What's one of yours?
Oh, well, you only gave one.
Well,
Are we going to go 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2?
I mean,
Okay.
I only have one, actually. No, I'm just kidding.
I would say, well, my gut reaction is to say withdraw. But I also think that I have different negative communication patterns with you than I do with other people. So I never escalate with you, but I do with our kids. Like, I just get super mad sometimes, and it does make me yell at them. But I don't know that I've ever yelled at you. I would say, so my biggest one with you is withdraw. I think part of that is because I want to formulate an argument, which is probably in response to your invalidation. Like, well, I know if I say something stupid, Chris is going to rip apart my argument. And so I have to think long and hard about having a rock solid, ironclad comment to say to you before I say it. I think that part of the reason also that I withdraw, though, comes from a positive place, but it ends up hurting our relationship because I don't communicate that I am thinking. I think I don't want to say something that will hurt you right away. And I want to make sure that I'm not speaking out of emotion. I want to make sure that I'm saying what I mean and that I actually mean what I say. So oftentimes I just take a really long time to respond, which is infuriating for you. And so I've had to learn to say, hey, I'm just thinking. I don't know what to say. I need some time. But then even like you're always the first to come back and say, hey, we need to address this. I'm not good at calling time in either.
Yeah, I think in response to your withdrawal, over time, I think this is we've gotten better at some things and worse at others. So I think it probably used to be that I would escalate things, not in an angry way.
Yeah.
But I would keep my foot on the gas because I'd be trying to process this. And when you would
like,
withdraw,
well, we need to
I'd be
talk
like,
about
no,
this.
we need to talk about this.
Yeah.
Stop running away. And so, yeah, I think I stopped doing that, but I do think now, in response to your withdrawing, I probably withdraw. So if you sit there for 30 minutes and think through, and I'm not exaggerating, it's literally 30 minutes if we're having a conversation.
He's not exaggerating.
Sit there in silence for 30 minutes and then come out with your super well-crafted, rock-solid argument as to why you're right and I'm wrong or whatever. I just withdraw because I'm like, this is stupid. I'm not going to come up with a rock-solid like argument for you.
Because that's not the way you think. It's not the way you communicate.
And the fact that you're being silent for 30 minutes is just stupid to me. So I'm just like, okay, I'm done then. I guess if it doesn't matter enough to you to just like hash it out with me, which is the wrong mindset.
Right.
I already know that. Yeah. But like, then I just sort of like, whatever. Okay, fine. I'll
Guess
go
we're not
else.
fixing this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think my top two would be IW.
Yeah. So my first one was withdraw. I do think that my second one is negative.
Interpret.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
That's definitely yours.
Oh gosh,
don't negatively interpret how I just agreed with that.
Yeah, I don't know if it was, they talk about like family of origin, and I do think like maybe it comes from a background of not knowing what people were thinking, and so give me a little insecurity, and all of a sudden when Chris asks if he can help with dinner, I think he's saying I keep a bad home. And it sounds crazy, but that is how it feels. Or like Chris wants to help with the laundry, and all of a sudden I feel guilty and he thinks that I'm lazy. It's just, I do negatively.
Which for the record is not at all true.
It's not true at all. And so it is hard to, like, when we're in an argument, he says one thing and I interpret it as totally different than what he actually meant. Yeah. And that is just, we've gotten a little bit better. I've learned, I think we even talked about this with our premarital counselor. He said, you need to learn the sentence, when you blanked, I felt blank. And so I think even just being able to put to words like, hey, when you said this, I interpreted it as this.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something I do poorly.
Yeah. I think that one to me is everyone. Look, everybody does that in some way, shape, or form. And it is just a byproduct of our insecurities and the way we feel, it's like anything that you are insecure about. If somebody says something that even at all hints at that, you're like, oh, you see it plain as day, your insecurity. They probably don't.
Yeah.
But you think they see it. And so you're sensitive about it. And I think we all do that.